There we go. My camera's working now. Yay! Alright, so today we're going to be talking about what makes a great protagonist. Um, Great protagonists typically are people that you remember easily. You know, when I say, Harry Potter, you remember Harry Potter. When I say Bilbo Baggins, you remember that name too. You know, and making a great protagonist is I would say, pretty simple for the most part. We're going to talk about today what makes a great protagonist and also what defines a protagonist, because some people um, don't realize what all a protagonist encompasses. So, first of all, um, likability. They have to be at least kind of sort of likable. If they're a psycho, you know those books where it's like it's from the villain's point of view, but you somehow enjoy it. Yeah, typically the likability factor there is making you feel sympathy or empathy for their situation. So, an example of this would be if you've ever read the Lunar Chronicles, they have the book from the Evil Queen's perspective. And at first I was thinking, ugh, there's no way I could possibly like her. And then I read it and I was like, I sad now. Because she actually had a really, really sad backstory that made me actually kind of like her. By the end, I was like, okay, you're still crazy, you still do bad things, you're still absolutely nuts. But I can at least understand where you're coming from. A similar example of this would be the newest President Snow. A lot of songbirds and snakes, where everyone was thinking, President Snow, you cannot possibly make me like President Snow. And yet everyone was sitting there going, why do I like him? Because she made him a relatable person. And sure, yeah, he became and kind of lost himself at the end and kind of fell into greed and power rather than sitting with his roots, which were kindness and charity. But at the same time, he had those likable traits. Even if they were at the beginning and they were lost by the end, he still had something that you liked him for. So you got to make sure your character is likable. If your character is just like, I'm amazing and I hate everything, no one's gonna like them. And they're not gonna be a good protagonist. They're gonna pick up the book and go, ugh, and put it down. So you gotta make sure they have something that's likable about them. Even if they are a prissy, like, ugh, I hate everything person, maybe their parents are going through a divorce and that's why they're so like, ugh, I hate everything. Find what makes them likable. Everyone's likable to some degree. To some degree. There are definitely psychos out there and really, really mean people out there that just are not likable. But most people, your average people, have something that is likable about them. Ugh. I've resorted to Windex today. No! Okay. This marker's the worst officially, but oh well. We'll move on. Alright. So, next thing, you want to make sure that the reader knows their history. If the reader doesn't know anything about them and they're just like, their name is Sam. Great. Does Sam have blue eyes? Does Sam like baseball? Is Sam a boy, a girl, gender neutral? I don't know. Like, tell me something more than just a name. This is something that a lot of people fall into with the short story category that I've noticed in particular, where they'll be like, I have 8 characters, and then they'll be like, Sam, Billy, Bob, Tim, Joe, and I'm like, I don't know any of these people, and by the end you don't get to know them any better because all you know is that Joe's wearing a panda costume, and you're like, that's not helpful. So I guess he likes pandas. That doesn't make him 3 dimensional. That just makes him weird. But so make sure that you give a little bit of history. And you can give a history in a very simple way. A lot of people think you have to give chapters and chapters of backstory in order to have a 3 dimensional character. That's not necessarily true. You can have a 2-minute interaction that will give you the entire setup of a character's backstory. I think I've mentioned this before, but maybe I haven't. There was a TV show that my husband and I were watching recently, and in this particular TV show, it had 2 sentences, and in those 2 sentences, you knew everything you needed to know about these 2 characters. There was this lady screaming and yelling at these loggers, and the loggers are sitting there looking like, oh, ugh, it's this lady again. And then when the lady leaves, the guy turns to him and goes, what are you going to do about that wife of yours? And he's like, there's a reason she's my ex-wife. And it's like, oh my, like you just got a lot of history there in 2 lines. And you realize that there's, she's an environmentalist and he's a logger. How did they even get together in the first place? And it makes them much more three-dimensional in less than a minute. So, with short stories in particular, and building history of your characters, try to build it naturally into the scenes or the dialogue. And try to find a way to introduce it simply. Another good example of this, I'm going to give an example from an actual contest winner that we had. Her name is Julie Graham. You can look at one of her winners from last year's contest on the library website. She's really cool. But for the Scary Story contest, she was also one of our winners. And it made me laugh so hard because literally the first line, you already know what's happening because they were talking about robbing graves on Halloween. And it's like, okay, so we got some context. They're grave robbers. It's Halloween. Like, we already know so much about them. And especially because she was saying, hey, I don't like this idea. This is spooky. This is bad. We're going to, like, die. And so and the other guy was like, toughen up. And so you kind of already get the idea that this guy's like, I don't believe in the supernatural. And the other girl's like, I think we're going to get murdered by a ghost. And so that gives a lot of history to those characters without needing all that extra, like, 5 chapters of backstory. Which can be great if you're writing a novel, but if you're doing a short story, you don't necessarily need to go crazy. Oh my gosh. Evil. Be gone. Alright. Next thing is make sure you not only have what are called try and fail cycles, but also make sure that with your try and fail cycles, that they actually are trying and failing. The one thing that a lot of people run into, unfortunately, is that they will have the issue of they'll have the character try it and be like, oh my gosh, I failed, and then second try, perfection. And it's like, that's not how that works. I don't know about you, but most of the time when I try something the first time, I don't completely and utterly just like figure out everything I did wrong and then do it perfectly the second time. Most people takes at least 3 or 4 tries, sometimes more. And beyond that, you got to make sure they're building up with things. A great example of this is actually a TV show called Heroes. One of them is named Hiro, ironically, Nakamura. And he is this Japanese man who learns that he has control over time and space. However, at first, all he can do is stop time for literally 1 second. That's it. He focuses really, really, really hard and stops time for 1 singular second. It's like, good job, bro. And so, of course, his best friend's like, sure you did. And then he continues to have problems with his powers throughout the whole first season. It's not just like, guess what, I stopped time for a second and now I'm the master. It's like, no, he goes back in time 6 months instead of 6 hours. He goes forward in time. He goes sideways in time. He ends up having to talk to himself because he's like, I screwed up the time-space continuum. So, like, heck, there's even some in the second series where he's like, completely and utterly doing just fine fighting the bad guy, and then all of a sudden he disappears into time and space and ends up freaking in ancient Japan. So, like, there's a lot of things where he fails a lot. And that's what makes him so much more likable because he's not just like, I'm the master of time and space and I'm awesome immediately. It's like, no, he struggles and he has a hard time and he has to work through things. That, once again, makes our characters more likable. And it also helps them not feel quite so over, which can be a problem. And to clarify, I don't mean overpowered in someone overpowering you. I mean overly powerful, but overpowered is the slang term. If you're at risk of your characters feeling overly powerful, I would say give them some other challenge. So, for example, Sherlock Holmes. He seems overly powerful, right? Because he's super good at solving crime. But he sucks at his social life and sucks at not being addicted to drugs. And so, even though he's super powerful at one thing, he is still relatable because you're like, oh my gosh, that's rough, buddy. And so you gotta have something they're bad at. And when I say something they're bad at, I mean truly horrendously bad at. Not just like, oh, well, they're kind of bad at math. Well, okay. Or alternatively, they have a mole that they're really self-conscious about. That's not something they're bad at. You got to make sure that there's something they genuinely struggle with. All right, next things we're going to talk about is growth. Now, this can be really fun for characters too. For example, Zuko from Avatar: The Last Airbender. He has a ton of growth, right? That's what makes him so likable and relatable. Is in the beginning you're like, ugh, you suck, and then you're like, okay, you suck less, and then you're like, I love you, bro, you're awesome by the end of the series. But I won't say how that happens, but I will say he does become a lovable protagonist. So it's because he goes through a ton of growth, and seeing that growth helps us to find them much, much more appealing, and it also helps us to realize that they can change, and it's very inspiring because a lot of us, I don't know about you guys, but a lot of people believe, hey, I suck at math, therefore I will always suck at math. Or hey, I always will suck at this thing, or hey, I'm not good enough at this thing. We're always beating up on ourselves, right? We find something to beat up about. We shouldn't, but we do. And so the seeing someone else grow past their faults and past their struggles is very inspiring and very much helps us to see them as a full person. Everyone is growing and changing, even if it's for the worse. For example, with Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, he grew up all right into a terrible person. Um, so as long as you have growth, that's the most important thing. It doesn't necessarily have to be positive growth. It can definitely be negative growth if that's what you need. If you're like, hey, he needs to be a horrible person by the end of this, then negatively have them grow, I guess. Or anti-grow? I don't know how to consider that. All right. So now we're going to discuss plot and protagonists. So, what makes someone a protagonist versus not a protagonist? It isn't whether or not they are a positive person. You can, like I said, you can have a villain, you can have an anti-hero. Antagonist can even be your protagonist, which sounds weird because you're like, antagonist is a protagonist. What? Antagonist just means they are going against the goals of the protagonist, but that doesn't necessarily mean that your antagonist cannot be a protagonist. Um, you might have multiple protagonists, in which case one of your protagonists is the antagonist. That was really complicated, but a great example of this is like Loki. Loki and Thor in the Marvel movies. Technically, Loki is a protagonist, but he's also the antagonist because Thor is constantly trying to save the world and Loki's constantly trying to blow it up. So he's an antagonist, but he's still a protagonist because he's still a main character. The issue that you fall into is when the villain slash antagonist is not a main character. They have a main role in the plot, but they don't have that main character like scene where you're like, hey, I'm going to devote some time to them specifically. All right. But back on plot, protagonist needs to have a problem that needs to be solved and is essential for the plot to continue. If they, yeah, honestly, the problem you're going to run into here is your protagonist needs to be crucial to the plot. If they die, everything's over. The book's over, the series is over, the world explodes. Like, they need to live. The problem that you're going to run into is that some people are like, oh, well, they're just a fun person to be the perspective of. Then they're not really a protagonist, they're a side character. For example, tragic to say, for those of you who enjoy Harry Potter, Ron and Hermione could have died and everything would have moved on. I'm sorry, but it would have. Yes, they help Harry. Yes, they support Harry. But ultimately, Harry's the protagonist and Harry's the reason the story keeps moving forward. That's what differentiates between a side character and a main protagonist. You can have side protagonists, yes, but typically protagonist means main character. If they die, the plot is over, the book is over, everything ends. And that's something you can do too with your story. Kill off your character and see what would happen if you killed them off. If you kill them off and the plot keeps going, they're not your right protagonist. You should kick them back and find someone else. Fire them and find a new hero. Yes.
What's up to like the narrator too though? Because I remember reading this one book. Yeah. It was all about it centered around this like criminal guy and how like he like changed the world and all this stuff.
Yeah, yeah.
but the entire story was told from the point of view of his girlfriend. So like, is
Yeah.
that possible to still like the narrator not be the protagonist?
Absolutely. The narrator does not have to be the protagonist. Your protagonist should be the person who's moving the plot forward. Your narrator doesn't necessarily move the plot forward unless you had like a Studio C narrator, if you've ever seen that, where it's like, and he got shot in the face and things like that, and it actually comes from nowhere. Um, so if your narrator is literally manipulating the story, then yeah, they're a protagonist, but your narrator doesn't have to be an active part of the plot. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So, to make a great protagonist, you need both internal as well as external struggles. If you have just external struggles, then you struggle with relatability and three dimensionality. If they only have internal struggles, then you have no plot. So, you need to make sure you have both. And they can overlap sometimes. That happens a lot in Percy Jackson, where he's like, ugh, I just want to be a normal person. Internal struggle. External struggle is, ugh, I have to save the world though. And so they do overlap. And they can overlap quite frequently. But you can also have them be totally separate, where they're trying to catch a internal problem. I really just want to go to prom and have a good prom night. And so that way you're like, hey, this is a big problem. But I also have my own issues with what I want in my life that have nothing to do with this other problem. And that can make them much more three-dimensional, because oftentimes that happens, right? I mean, heck, police officers aren't like must catch criminal 24/7. Like, no, they go home, they have a life. Most of them. Most of them will go home, they have a life, they have maybe a wife and kids, like they have something to go home to. And so if you don't have those internal struggles, they're not a real person, because you might be thinking about stuff like that when you're out doing other stuff like that, right? You might be at a track meet going like, oh, cool, the external struggle is, do I win or not? And the internal struggle is, crap, I have a math test tomorrow and I think I'm going to fail it. Not related, but important to you and therefore important to the reader. All right. Moving forward. Okay. A protagonist needs to take action. This is a problem that I have with, oh man, I can't even remember what it's called. Oh, I should have Googled it before this. But there is a book by Jane Austen, and the main character's name is Franny. And she's constantly like, ugh, my life sucks because I let everyone else make decisions for me. And I'm like, then do something, woman. But anyway, I don't like her most of the book, because then by the end she's finally like, I will make decisions. And I'm like, it took you 400 pages to get there. But anyway, so most people prefer when characters take action and they actually do things. If you are going to have a Franny-esque character, you've got to explain why they feel that way. For example, with Franny, the whole idea was back in Regency times, women had a lot of decisions made for them, and it kind of sucked. And so it was kind of a political statement, but I don't like political statements, so I didn't like it. But if you're going to do something like that, like the character feels they can't make their own decisions, you got to explain why. Is it because they're a kid and they feel like if they make the decisions, maybe they'll make their own one? Is it because of the fact that they have too many other struggles in life and they don't feel like they can do anything about this? Do they feel powerless for some other reason, whether it's gender, sexuality, something else that is repressing them or making them feel like they are stuck for whatever reason? But you still got to have them take some sort of action. Like, even with Franny, she did small acts of rebellion. Way too small, in my opinion. But small acts of rebellion where she'd be like, I'm going to go date this guy anyway, even though you don't want me to. And things like that. And then, of course, she'd get told off, and then she'd be like, I'm sorry, I'll never do it again. And it's like, okay. But anyway. Make sure that they're taking some form of action. And yes, this can bother you sometimes. It's like those moments in scary movies where you're like, just sit there and don't move. And they're like, I'm going to go open the door where there's clearly a serial killer outside. And you're like, ah! But also, it would be a really boring movie if they just sat there the whole time. So you got to have them take some sort of action. You've got to have someone acting on the plot, changing the plot, moving things forward. You don't want the plot acting on them. if the plot is acting on them and they are just being passively buffeted around, which is more interesting to watch? A snowplow actively moving the snow everywhere, or snow just being drifted around in the wind? Like, sure, that can be magical for a little bit, but if you watch that for 2 hours, I think you're gonna get bored. Whereas with the snowplow, you're like, hey, you're watching them not only move all this snow, but you're watching them go down different streets, go down different areas. Maybe you see something crazy happening in someone's yard while you're watching the snowplow. Like, it's a lot more interesting and active. And it's got to be the same way with your character. Sure, they can have some passive moments where they're like, "Oh, my dad grounded me and now I'm stuck," but you also have to have moments where they're like, "My dad grounded me and I'm stuck, so I'm gonna sneak out." They have to do something about it, not just be a princess in a tower. All right. Next thing we are going to talk about is flaws. It's incredibly important that you give them flaws. And yes, we talked earlier about having struggles, but struggles and flaws are different. Struggles are things that are internal struggles, or alternatively something that they're not good at, or something that they're working to be better at, or need to be better at. Flaws are things like with President Snow in Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes. His desire for power and respect ultimately was his downfall, right? And that's a big flaw of his. He could have sought to be a good person, could have sought to help people, and instead he decided that the best way to do that was to get respect and power. And he ultimately got greedy. And so that's their main flaw. And you gotta kind of look at it similarly. We all have flaws, right? You know, some of us might have a rage problem. Others of us might be really like passive and not willing to act on things. Some people might really love money. You might have a main character who's like, I will be a hero all the time if you pay me. That's a problem. um, and so you got to decide what your character's flaws are. What makes them human? Because ultimately, if they are flawless, why are we reading about them? They're like some sort of godly being, which I guess could be interesting from a different standpoint. But typically, most protagonists need a flaw in order for them to be more relatable. Is my coworker. She's great. um, all right, let's see. Where was I? Got distracted by Hannah. All right. So, I know you probably heard this 1,000 times, but make sure to try to show, don't tell. Now, you can tell, and you need to tell every once in a while, tactfully. If you're just constantly being like, she is mad because her dad did this, and because her mom did this, and now because her mom and dad are fighting, she decided to go do this. That's not very interesting. Whereas, if you say, well, her mom and dad are fighting, and because of that, her dad grounded her, and her mom, and stomped off into the night. that's just like, okay, well, we know that. How's that helpful? But if you have like the door slammed behind her mother and she thought to herself, perhaps if I snuck out just a little bit, I could forget this ever happened. That way it makes it much more interesting. You're much more in the character's head instead of just saying, the world sucks. It's like, okay, why does it suck? What about it is sucky? What about it is hard? With showing and not telling, though, like I said, you can tactfully tell every once in a while and be like, so and so hated being grounded. That's telling, but it's a little bit more tactful. And sometimes you need that to get your points across. If you describe every single bush along the hike, then it's going to take forever. But if you say the hike was forever long, we're good. But the reason showing is important with protagonists is because protagonist needs secrets and intrigue to help keep you interested. If you just tell us, yes, and she secretly has a crush on so and so in biology class is actually an alien, like, no longer interested. But if you're like, she saw a tentacle flick out of their backpack, you're like, what the? Much more interesting, much more intrigue, makes you go like, is she crazy? Did she actually see that? Do they have an octopus in their bag? Makes it much more that you want to keep reading from this protagonist's point of view. So make sure that you show rather than tell, especially with emotions. Like I was saying earlier, if her parents were fighting and the mom stormed out and dad grounded her, show that instead of just saying she got grounded and mom stormed out. Well, what emotions does that evoke? Does the mom slam the door as she leaves? Does the dad scream um, at the ceiling after she leaves and is like, "Wait, don't leave!" Like, what what really happens there? And that's going to also determine how the character feels. Is her heart racing because she hates to see her parents fight? Or is she kind of numb to it and it's like, the fifth fight this week, you know? um, that's going to tell us a lot about the character too by seeing how they react to that. All right, moving forward. All right, last thing that we're going to talk about today. So whatever you have that's trying to stop them needs to be compelling for the reader and the audience. This is where it comes into knowing your audience. For example, with Jane Austen, she knew that her audience would like political commentary. And so the fact that her aunt and uncle were constantly trying to stop her from dating this guy that was a lower class than her, it's like, that's very compelling for them. However, for me, it was like, this isn't really my thing. So you also got to take into account your genre. What is compelling to the readers of your genre? Is it going to be a serial killer because it's a murder mystery novel? Is it going to be people keeping secrets because it's drama? Is it going to be, the classic fairy tale ending because everyone likes a good old fairy tale ending? What is compelling about the thing trying to stop them? Is it because they're a really alluring villain? Is it because it's an earthquake and there's nothing they can do to stop it, but they're trying to survive? Is it the zombie apocalypse? And that's what makes it compelling because they're interested in how the zombie apocalypse works and how they're going to survive it. What about the plot that is going against them is going to make it interesting for your reader? There are so many different ways you can do this, as is evident by the multiplicity of different genres out there. But if the thing trying to stop your character is just like, well, she has to save the world, but she's grounded. Well, run away then. Like, go save the world. So make sure it's compelling and going to actually stop them. Because if it's not going to stop them, it's like, okay, problem solved. All right. Any questions about making really great, impactful protagonists? Yes.
You say like you want our protagonist to like take action a lot.
Yeah.
But what happens like when the protagonist is in a situation like at a really low point in the book where they can't take action at all? And,
it's okay for them to take a break and to feel stuck. Especially if you emphasize that they're frustrated by it. If they're an action-based character and they feel stuck and feel like they can't do anything, that is going to make them really frustrated, right? It's going to make them go like, oh, geez, I wish there was something I could do about it. And that drama, that internal struggle of, I wish there was anything I could do to fix this, is very much compelling and very much is interesting to the reader, especially because there are times in our own lives where we feel stuck and are like, there's nothing I can do about this situation. And so I would say that's very compelling so long as that's not the way they are for the whole book. That's the main issue here is how much of the book does that take up? Does it take up a couple chapters or is it like the beginning of the book all the way till the climax? That's too much. Unless, like I said, that's the whole point is that it's a political commentary on they can't do anything because of X thing. So like if you were writing a book about a woman in a country where women are completely and utterly seen as like inferior, you might have most of the book where she's like doing kind of like Franny did, where it's like a quiet rebellion rather than like an out extroverted rebellion. However, I would still say have them try to do something or at least be frustrated that they can't. If they're just like, oh, well, I can't do anything, then they don't make a very good protagonist because they give up too easily. Does that make sense? Okay. Any other questions about protagonists and making them memorable slash um, writing them well? Yes.
So I want to like do my protagonist flaws.
Mm-hmm.
I want them to just like constantly make really dumb mistakes throughout the book.
So you don't or you do?
Well, how can I find like a middle ground? Because I don't want them to do stupid things like destroy the story.
Yeah. Typically, you want to find a flaw that suits them, but also suits your purposes for the story. So, for example, with Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, the flaw of him being very greedy for power and respect very much fuels the story, right? And you can have things that fuel the story. Another great example of the Heroes, one that we were just watching. Hiro Nakamura's biggest flaw is that he loves things too much. And being someone who can go back in time and fix everything, that's a big problem. Because then he's like, I want to save everyone. Everyone ever. I want to make everything better. And it's like, you can't make everything better, dude. You're going to ruin the space time continuum if you save every single person. So you can even have it be a positive flaw like that, where it's like, it's not really a flaw to love people and to want to save them and to want to help people, but it becomes a flaw because he's a time space continuum traveler. And if you constantly are altering the time space continuum, things are going to go horribly wrong. So I would say make sure that it fuels the story rather than just being like, oh, well, they have the flaw of wanting power or money, and then you're like, well, all they have to do is throw money at them, and now the plot's over. So I would say the best balance is picking the right flaw, making it so that it does tempt them, it does cause problems, but it's not necessarily going to derail your plot or cause problems for your story. Or if it does cause problems, like with Hiro Nakamura, it causes problems in a way that's interesting for your viewers slash readers. Okay, other questions about protagonists and creation of them? We good? Okay. Reminder that there is a story contest going on right now. Everything is due the 30th of May, so that's coming up real quick. We have a month and a half left. It is a 3,000 word limit. And aside from that, the prompt is write a fantasy short story about a character encountering a mysterious waterfall. You can decide what makes it mysterious, whatever you like, as long as it's fantasy primarily. And I say fantasy primarily because obviously if you want to have a slight sci-fi twist, you're more than welcome to. For example, Star Wars is sci-fi fantasy. Um, but if it is like purely sci-fi, you will get docked a few points for that because it's supposed to be fantasy. If you have any questions, please let me know. I'm going to turn off the video now, and you can ask any questions you'd like about writing in general.